Hello, welcome to Earth Sciences. So this is APS 101, and we're going to be covering Chapter 1, the Introduction to Earth Science. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at are the objectives. So there are four main objectives for this chapter, and these objectives are written at the beginning of each chapter in the textbook. So the first objective is to list and describe the sciences that collectively make up Earth science. Okay, and then we'll look at the rest later. So let's go look at these sciences. Now, first of all, we have to describe physical science. Physical science involves the study of the Earth and all the processes that affect change on the Earth, this ever-changing Earth. So things change. You have an earthquake that changes the ground. You have a volcano that changes the soil. It changes the atmosphere. So there's a lot going on in our planet all the time. And so this chapter is trying to bring that idea together. So when you read the description of this class, it said it was a holistic class. And that doesn't mean that it is New Age exactly. It means that it is looking at the whole Earth, and not just the Earth, but its interactions with other um, celestial objects. So we interact with the sun, and actually, other planets can interact with us, and the moon interacts with the Earth. So, for instance, we have tides. So, anyway, so there's a lot going on in our planet. All right, now physical science, we often will have to go in and look at some of the fundamental sciences, such as physics and chemistry. Now, we've thrown biology in here because biology is also affected by the objects on the earth. We are part of our planet, we animals and people. The earth sciences, more specifically, have to do with astronomy, geology, oceanography, and hydrology, so fresh water, and also meteorology, which is weather and atmosphere. So we'll be looking at each of these. All right, now the Earth is constantly changing. So, like I said, we're going to be looking at the processes. So, there's erosion, there's radiation from the sun and from the Earth, there's evaporation, there is weathering of rocks, and there are volcanoes that bring about large changes. And our whole Earth has motion in the plates. So, lots of processes here on Earth that are changing things all the time. So that's the holistic viewpoint that we're looking at. Okay, so we're going to be looking at what science is. So, what's the nature of scientific inquiry? And we'll be looking specifically at what is a hypothesis and what is a theory. So, science has rules. That's what scientists like to think. We believe the natural world is consistent, it's predictable. And so we talk about the laws of nature. Science tries to provide explanations for the natural world. So science is all about the natural world. And of course, our natural world includes the whole universe. And we are looking at the big picture and the most fundamental picture. So we are looking at atoms and forces. So scientific theories are constructed to explain the observed phenomena. And we use what's called the scientific method to progress in understanding. Hmm. Okay, we have a bit of a trouble here, but we'll figure it out. Okay, now scientific knowledge is public knowledge. So one of the main goals of science is to share that knowledge with others. It's actually a requirement of the scientific method. And so, one thing is that when we're looking at a phenomena, like why is the sky blue, it has to be capable of observation by many people, independent observers. So, many people agree that the sky is often blue. And we try to distinguish between opinions and facts and hypothesis and theory. So, a fact might be something like the sky is blue. And an opinion might be I like blue. All right, so let's look at what a hypothesis is and what a theory is. Okay, now here's some of the important people who have helped make advances in science, but mostly I put in these two pictures to show the contrast. It used to be that people were, well, usually working alone. So here you've got your alchemist, and he's often working alone. And if he discovered something interesting, often he would keep it secret. So people kept things secret because they were going to make a profit from them, perhaps. Like if you made a better sword, then you might save that knowledge for your guild. And so, really, people didn't progress for many thousands of years very much in terms of science because the secrets would die with them. Progress didn't happen. Now, this other picture is kind of showing our shiny world we have today, where everything is very shiny. We have lots of lights, okay, electricity. We have light bulbs. We've got chemicals that are in our daily life, whether we want them or not. We are surrounded by marvels of science. And so we're at this point. The world has changed because of us, and we are changed because of us and because of science too. So, some of the people who helped make science what it is were Aristotle and Archimedes and Galileo and Boyle and Isaac Newton and Antoine Lavoisier. And we'll be discussing a couple of these, but mostly those were pure scientists. And we'll be discussing some geologists too. And some of these we will discuss when we talk about astronomy. Okay, so a scientist takes an initial observation. So the sky is blue. That might be one. Or you might say all cats have tails. And so you would try to have a hypothesis. The hypothesis has to try to explain the given phenomena. So you might say, well, the sky is blue because maybe oxygen is blue. So this is saying that, so you try to use your best knowledge. So you might know that air has oxygen in it. And so that might be a guess that you would have. So basically, we call a hypothesis sometimes an educated guess. Now, it has to be based on two criteria: objective observations, that's the idea that the sky is blue, and it also has to be testable. Okay, so the sky is blue because oxygen is blue. So we have to think, can we test that? And so you could think up some ideas, some ways to test that. So you might try to isolate oxygen from the nitrogen in the air, maybe have it in the lab, check it out. Is it blue? You might think, okay, I could go to places on the earth where there's a higher oxygen content. Would the sky be more blue? You could take oxygen out of some air and look to see, does that look blue? And so, anyway, so you would try some different experiments. Eventually, you would find out that it's not quite because oxygen is blue. Okay, so that hypothesis turns out to be incorrect. Oxygen is not blue colored. Um, but it is true that it's the particles of oxygen and nitrogen that are in the air, and that they will take light that's coming from the sun and has many wavelengths of light, many colors, and the blue one gets scattered more. So when we look at any point in the sky, we'll usually see blue. If we're just looking at the sun, at the light directly, then we will see white because that's many colors. So anyway, so that turns out to be a hypothesis that is not true. So we test it, we try to falsify the hypothesis, and then along the way what we learn one more fact about the phenomena that we're trying to explain. So in this case, it's okay. In science, it's all right that a hypothesis is not true. Now, if you test it many, many times and it cannot be hypothesized or falsified, then it could become what's called a theory. A theory is a higher level. It has been tested already and it has not been falsified. And so theories are very solid. Okay. A hypothesis is just a guess. Okay. An educated guess, something to test. But the theory is something that's been tested. So this becomes what's called the scientific method. You propose an idea, the hypothesis, and then you test it many times and you try to see if it's going to be false or not. Okay, so a valid hypothesis has to be based on objective observations, like the sky is blue or cats have tails. Um, Usually, right? You're already thinking, oh, what about Manx cats? They don't have tails, right? So that's the idea. It's something that many people might agree on, and then you have to test it. And we would test it by looking at all sorts of cats if we were looking at that one. So anyway, so if you're looking at yes answers to both of those questions, then it could be a valid hypothesis. And again, just because it's proven incorrect, it does not mean it's failed science. Instead, that helps to narrow the possible ideas. And people just have to go back and think about it some more, try another angle. Like I said, the sky is blue because we have an atmosphere and light gets scattered in that atmosphere. So oxygen was involved. It's just not in the way that hypothesis originally was stating it. Okay, so let's look at these possible hypotheses and see if any of them are good as hypotheses. And also keep an eye out. Some of them might be opinions or facts. And we're looking for a genuine hypothesis, a reasonable explanation that can be tested. So, physics is the greatest science. All right, that one, yeah, you're probably thinking, yep, that's more of an opinion, right? Now, since I am a physicist, I might say, oh, that's a fact. But no, that would be an opinion. Okay, now leaves turn red in the fall. Okay, so that would be something that we usually can agree on, at least in this area, that leaves turn red in the fall. Not all trees, not all leaves, but in general, we're looking at those leaves that do turn red in the fall. And this hypothesis, an explanation might be that they have an iron shortage. Okay, so it's something that we can test, right? All right, now C says black holes are filled with an undetectable substance. All right, now the problem with this one, well, how do we test something that's undetectable? So this one is probably not a fact at all because we don't know this yet. It's much more of an opinion in that case. Okay. So we've got one hypothesis, and this, which we're not sure what that is, but probably more of an opinion. Then we were put on this earth to find happiness. That's D. We were put on the earth to find happiness. Well, that again would probably have to be an opinion. Okay, it's very difficult to test something like that. How you have to define happiness for one thing. And there's something in here about purpose. We were put on this earth. Okay, so B is the one that we could test. Now, as it turns out, B is also a false hypothesis. It will not be true. And for one thing, it's because it says that the leaves have an iron shortage. And iron usually will turn things red. So the logic there is a little weird. But the other reason is people have found out why leaves are red. And if you look down here at these leaves, you see how beautiful these are. This is just the leaf skeleton. And it turns out that the reason that we see leaves as green is because we're looking at the chloroplasts that are in there, turning the energy from sunlight into fuel that the cells can use. And so that's going on, and they turn the leaf green. They reflect green. The trees don't actually want green light. They reject that. They prefer the red, the blue light instead. So plant light will have red and blue lights. Anyway, so what happens is at the end of fall, trees stop producing these, and the green cells die out, or they even can be sucked back into the trunk of a tree to save for the next spring. And so as the cells leave that make the plant green, then what you're left with is light reflecting off the skeleton, and so you see reds and oranges and yellows. Okay, so it's a hypothesis, but again, it turned out to be a false hypothesis, or one that was wrong, and so the scientists will have to go try again. Okay, so when we're looking into science, so inquiry, scientists look for a question that they can explore. And once we have got some theories, then we can use those to predict or explain the future, or to talk about past events. So in this book, because we're often talking about the Earth, we're going to be talking about the past, about plate tectonics and how Florida came to be, and why we once in a while have earthquakes around here, and why California has a lot of earthquakes. And so we have to look to the past to explain the future. So scientific theories have to be open to modification. So you get a theory, and then you learn more about the science behind that theory, and then you can add to the theory. Sometimes they even can get abandoned, okay, if you can finally disprove them. So the evidence is everything in science. Look for the evidence. Everything has to be tested. Okay, now when we're studying geology, we are going to use theories that were made for geology. We'll do this especially when we talk about the past history of the planet. And so one of the theories that we'll use is called uniformitarianism. And the idea there is the present is the key to the past. Because all we can look at in our planet is what is here currently. So we have to look at what's here now to understand the past. And so Illinois, we have a lot of limestone. Limestone is created from the shells of clams. So the thing is, well, that implies that our clams and other sea creatures, our planet in this area used to be covered with water, so that there were shell creatures living in it. And so we have limestone now because Illinois used to have a shallow sea. Okay, so the present, the limestone, is the key to the past, the shallow sea that used to exist. Okay, so theories can be used to figure out what's going on around us. Okay, let's just look at some other scientific theories, some you are probably familiar with. So, a theory is a synthesis of well-tested and verified hypotheses. Now, often people get confused because they think a theory is just an idea that hasn't really been tested rigorously. And that's not right. When a scientist says theory, they should mean something that's been tested many times. So the atomic theory, we're all pretty probably good with that. We know that the world, things are made up of atoms. So even oxygen that we breathe in is O2, and nitrogen is out there, and there are atoms everywhere, and solids and liquids and gases. Okay, so most of us are pretty good with the atomic theory. The theory of relativity, pretty scary sounding, something Einstein came up with, and it's actually not that weird, as it turns out. Relativity, he was just talking about um, the idea that you can't really measure from any one point in the universe. That's part of that. So there is no still center to the universe. Now, the theory of evolution is one some people have trouble with because they say, well, theory, that's just an idea. But no, the idea was the hypothesis, but it's been tested many, many times. So one of those tests we're going to talk about was an accidental one, which involved what are called the pepper moths. And pepper moths are usually this lovely speckled pattern, like pepper, and that hides them well on the bark of trees. And some of them, though, come out this darker color. So it's usually about 90, more than 90% speckles, and only about 5% dark ones. So the idea with theories is that they undergo change and refinement. And the theory of evolution is one of those that has changed and evolved over the years as we have learned more about evolution itself, like DNA. Darwin didn't know about DNA. Okay, so the pepper moths are showing how environmental pressures can change the genetics of a species. And so in this case, you can see how the gray moth, the speckled one, hides well on the birch trees, but the black moths show off. So birds, when the moths are sleeping during the day, they can eat the black moths more often. But in the 1800s, there was an industrial revolution. There were lots of coal burned. There was no coal scrubber, so the trees and the buildings and everything was covered with grime, with coal dust and oils, and it was really nasty. And this is the time of Sherlock Holmes and the idea in those stories that you could hardly see down the block. You couldn't even see a few feet in front of you because the coal smoke had combined with the mist off the river in London. Anyway, so this experiment, this accidental one, took place in England during that time. So the trees got covered with blackness, and then you can see what would happen. The black moths now were hiding on the black trees, and the pale gray moths, the speckled ones, were being eaten by the birds. So what happened? Well, the genes for blackness now enabled the moths that were black to survive for longer. They were the ones that were able to reproduce. So their genes took over, and soon it was more than 90% black moths and less than 10% of the speckled variety. Okay, but a few genes still survived. But then pressures changed. The factories were cleaned up. There was less smoke. The trees got washed clean. And now the black moths could be seen against the bark during the day, and they got eaten up. And the pepper colored ones were the ones that now survived. So it went back the other way. So that's the idea of environmental pressures, which is what Darwin originally talked about. And this happens around us all the time. Humans are affecting animals everywhere. One of the places we affect them is fisheries. When people would fish, they would keep the larger fish, throw back the smaller ones. So what happens? Well, fish that are smaller would survive, better than the large ones. So gradually, fish actually got smaller out in the ocean because of the environmental pressures of people fishing. And so birds in some places are developing beaks that are a different shape because they can get into the wires of a bird feeder better. They eat more food, their babies survive, and so the beak that can get into the bird feeder is now an environmental advantage. Anyway, happens all over the world all the time. And so now that we know about genes, we know a little better about what's going on, but that doesn't mean Darwin was wrong. The environmental pressure is what drives some genes to last into the next generations. So there was an experiment that was done deliberately that went on for around 50 years and developed tame foxes. So they went through thousands and thousands of foxes in this experiment. It was in Russia, I believe. And what they would do is they would have cages of baby foxes, and they would come up to the cage and rattle it. And the baby foxes that snarled, they would take those and eventually make them into fur coats. The baby foxes that weren't too disturbed by this and would be friendly to the keepers, those got to live to breed again. So they were just trying to make a tame fox. Um, we have very few tame animals, only about 12 domesticated animals like horses and cows. And so they were trying to make a fox. So anyway, so they were breeding for tameness, but along the way, the foxes started to change their physical appearance too. So their sockets got a little bigger and rounder. Sometimes their ears were a little more floppy. Their tails got a little curvy. And it turned out that what happened was the gene for tameness, which was a faulty flight or fight gene, that was connected to a defective gene for cartilage. So what happened is that the foxes who were tame also had reduced amount of cartilage, and that's why their tails would curl and their ears flop more and their eye sockets get larger. So anyway, and so this actually happens in many domesticated animals, the same connection between those genes. So the animals will have many characteristics like that. So dogs are known for their big puppy dog eyes and floppy ears. And so anyway, so Darwin didn't know about genes, but now we can explain some of what's going on with the genes. So anyway, so the theory still holds, but it does get refined as our knowledge grows. Okay, so a law is a concise statement to describe a fundamental relationship of nature. So this is something that's observed in nature. The law does not explain it. It's just describing it, a relationship. So there are many, many laws. Newton is known for all the laws uh, that he was able to observe in nature. And so one of those laws is the law of conservation of mass, where there's no gain or loss of mass that occurs during a chemical reaction. That was Antoine Lavoisier, who lost his head in the French Revolution, by the way. Anyway, so we expect this nowadays. When you're in a chemistry class, they have you weigh the materials that are going into a chemical reaction. It's very important. But why is that? And we even know why nowadays. We can explain this now. We know that if you're having a chemical reaction, like if you have hydrogen and you're mixing it with oxygen, then then you can get water out of that. Oops, sorry. And so to balance the equation, we have to put a 2 here, and we get 2 waters here. And the thing is, why do we balance the equation? Because we know that we have to have the same number of atoms on the reactant side as we have on the product side. So we know now that atoms are part of this, right? So over here we have to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 atoms. On the right side, we have to have 1, 2, 3 times 2, that's 6 atoms also, right? 6 atoms and 6 atoms. So that's why there's no gain or loss of mass. Okay, but can you believe it when that was proposed? Nobody really knew about atoms. So this was just talking about the mass. All right, so now we know the explanation. Okay, so laws don't have to have explanations. They're just describing phenomena. Okay, so what is the scientific attitude? Extremely important. Remember we talked about those old alchemists and how they would keep things secret. Well, that's not allowed anymore. So you need to have a spirit of inquiry. You want to find answers to questions. You want to do those experiments. Okay, so used to be people would just make up ideas and not experiment. But nowadays we experiment. We find out the truth as close as we can get. Then openness and communication. This material must be published. Bad science is science that's kept in a closet. Good science is science that's put out there for the rest of the community to look at and to test themselves. It's very important in science to have ideas retested by many people. Okay, and then there's humbleness, because sometimes there has to be a willingness to admit error. Remember, your hypothesis may be incorrect. And even if you do a test, someone may point out that your test wasn't correct either. Well, that's part of the scientific process. We need to arrive at something close to the truth, so we need to find out what is untrue. And so uncertainty is okay in science. Science is about proposing things, testing them, right? So during that time, you're uncertain, and then you can say you've got something real, okay? Something close to what we think of as the truth in the universe. So anyway, so it's part of the scientific process to be uncertain, and all of these things go into making science what we have today. Science that is doing amazing things. Um, so many of us probably would be dead already if not for science. Usually I ask a class to raise their hand if they were saved by science. And usually it's about a third to a half of the class knows that they would be dead without science. I know I would have been dead the day I was born because I needed a blood transfusion right away. And so, and several deaths since then, like appendicitis and car wrecks. So many of us are alive due to science. We have progressed a great deal. Okay, so let's go look at the rest of this chapter. Okay, so again, remember science is public knowledge. It must be published. It has to be observed by independent observers who can retest. And again, we want to make sure that we're not just saying opinion. And it's not just a fact. Usually that would be closer to a law. But usually we will look for a hypothesis that we want to test. And eventually that hypothesis may become a theory. Okay, now remember we talked about how earth science composed of these sciences. There's geology, and there's physical geology, which is looking around the world today. So we're looking at the minerals and the rocks that exist today. And we also look back into the past, historical geology. Then we're looking at oceanography and other water processes, because water is a huge shaper of our planet. We look at meteorology, the weather, and the atmosphere, and astronomy, because we can't really talk about our planet and the changes that occur without talking about our sun and the energy that comes from the sun. So all of these things are important sciences that make up the earth science. Okay, now why do you care? Well, geologists usually study natural disasters. They can affect you. And studying natural disasters helps us to predict and prepare for future events. So it's very important if you're going to live in California, you will have to deal with wildfires, mudslides, earthquakes. I've been in all of those. I used to live in California. Um, if you want to live in Seattle, you've got a volcano. If you want to move to Australia, you're looking at more fires there, droughts. And so there's all this stuff that is a problem. Okay, so it's important. So, volcanoes, maybe you want to move to Seattle, maybe you're looking at Iceland. Here's this beautiful new lava flow out of Iceland. So that's happening right now. Here's an older lava flow that's cooled down a bit, but it's not very cool. It's still hot. So you also get hazardous fumes from the lava. So anyway, so lots of changes can happen because of volcanoes. Now, earthquakes and tsunamis affect certain areas usually. We'll talk about the ring of fire, places that are more prone to earthquakes. And of course, if you live in one of those areas, then you should prepare for disasters and be educated. So we'll be talking about that. Okay, in California, we lived through mudslides. So I remember how the mudslide occurred on the sorry. The mudslide came down on the road, so I couldn't get to college. Um, so I had to wait for it to get clear. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so this is a landslide. You can see it's taking a lot of the trees with it. Often landslides occur where ground has been cleared, but this one, there were still trees whose roots normally can help hold the earth together. Came down on a resort down below. But people did know it was happening, so they had cleared people out of that resort. Okay, so why else should you care? Well, geologists look for things like natural resources. So, do you have any of those? I'll bet you do. You're probably watching a computer right now. And so, if it's a computer with a battery, then you have to be aware of the materials that go into the batteries. Um, we have wiring like copper in your house. Is your home lit by natural gas? That's another resource that comes along often in the same location with oil. We'll talk about that. Did you drink water today? Probably that came from an aquifer. So anyway, so geologists often are the ones who will seek these things out because they are treasures hidden in the earth. And of course, soil can get contaminated, and geologists look for contamination, and we look for good places to live. So, Florida has many sinkholes. So that might be something, if you could afford it, is to have someone check out your area for sinkholes before you buy a home there. Okay, so let's look at the 1.4. So we're going to skip over 1.3. We're going to do that at the end of the formation of the solar system. But let's go ahead and look at the four major spheres. Okay, and why the Earth is considered to be a system. Okay, so the spheres. So this has to do with that holistic idea that we have interactive spheres of um, knowledge in our world. And so these are spheres of materials. So we have hydrosphere, which is water. So that could include the ocean. It could include lakes, rivers, and we'll be talking about each of these later. And the cryosphere is sort of a subset of the hydrosphere. It involves ice. There's the atmosphere, the biosphere, which is life, the geosphere, which involves the Earth. And these four spheres can interact and touch on each other and push on each other. And so that's called the Earth system. So the hydrosphere is the entire mass of water on the Earth. Water does cover around 71% of the Earth's surface. The oceans have about 97% of water, which means it's salty water. 97% of all the water on Earth. And so the hydrosphere includes both the freshwater and the saltwater. So there are oceans, lakes, streams, glaciers, frozen water, groundwater, and even water in the plants and the animals. So you yourself are part of the hydrosphere. The atmosphere is fairly thin, okay, covers the whole Earth's surface, but it's only about within 10 miles is where most of the atmosphere is, about 90%. So it's kind of a thin layer on the Earth. So if you think about the Earth as an apple, the atmosphere would kind of be the skin on the apple. Okay, whoop, not very thick. A thin little skin, not even as thick as the skin on an orange. Okay, so thin little atmosphere. And of course, that makes it easy to change. We'll talk about that when we talk about climate change. But that's where the weather is within that 10-mile radius. Okay, so all the life on Earth is part of the biosphere. So we're talking about plants, we're talking about animals, we're talking about all the organisms, we're talking about lions, tigers, bears. And this is my dog, Galileo. Unfortunately, Galileo died in June. So I will have new pictures of my new dog that I will try to insert perhaps. Anyway, Galileo there is representing a crazy looking dog. Anyway, so all of us we have water in us. And so we affect water. We are part of the biosphere. We are also part, as I said, of um, the geosphere. I didn't say that, but we are because we have minerals in us. Um, we are part of the atmosphere because we breathe in and change the atmosphere, right? We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So we interact with pretty much all the spheres. So hydrosphere, biosphere, geosphere, and atmosphere. Okay, so let's look at these spheres in more detail. So the geosphere, especially, is of course what we're going to study the most early on. Now we'll be getting to all of this later, so you don't have to memorize all this right now. But the geosphere does include all the rocks, the minerals, all the landforms, so mountains, valleys, everything from the crust down to the core of the Earth. It's all part of the geosphere. So it is a very, very big sphere. So the distance to the center of the Earth is 6,400 kilometers, which is about 3,800 miles. And it's divided into roughly three parts: the core, the mantle, the crust. So starting at the center, the core has two parts. It has the inner core and an outer core. And together, they go to about 3,400 kilometers. So that's about halfway out from the center of the Earth. And so anyway, so yeah, so these two make up a lot of it. Now, they are both iron and nickel, mostly iron, 90% iron. And other metals like gold and stuff will have sunk down into the center of the core of the Earth, but it's not very much of that. So mostly iron. The inner core is solid. The outer core is liquid. So it's molten metal. And the inner core is a solid, even though it's the hottest, because it is under such great pressure from all the atoms pushing down on it. So it becomes a solid, whereas the outer core is under less pressure, and so it has a liquid state. Okay, so solid metal, molten metal. Okay, so then we would come out to the mantle. Okay, so solid core, liquid core, mantle. So the mantle takes up most of the rest of the planet Earth, except for the very thin crust on top. Okay, so the mantle is more high density rock, but it too is divided into two parts like the core. So there's a lower mantle and an upper mantle. And the thing is that even though this rock is solid, the asthenosphere can actually have movement in it. Okay, so there's movement in here of the rock. It's kind of like wax. Wax is a solid, but you know if it's warm, you can move it around with your finger. You can push on hot wax and reshape it, right? It's still a solid, but you can reshape it. It moves slowly. So the asthenosphere has rock that is moving slower. Now the upper mantle is a little more um, less movement in it. Okay, it's more solid or rigid rock. Now, and then on the very top is what's called the crust that has low density rock like quartz, lots of quartz. And so anyway, it is rigid also. So the two rigid pieces have also sometimes they're called the lithosphere. So the lithosphere is those two rigid parts, the crust and the upper mantle. And we live, of course, on top of the mountain, so on top of the crust. And so anyway, so the lithosphere is only about 100 kilometers thick, as opposed to the lower mantle altogether, um, and the upper mantle. Okay. So anyway, so the lithosphere is the uppermost part of the mantle. And the crust is only about 7 to 70 kilometers thick. The part which is the continental crust is much thicker, and the part that makes up oceanic crust is much thinner. Okay, so this is a little confusing because things cross over here, but that's the way they do it in geology. Okay, so we'll be talking more about that later. Okay, so now system is used specially where you need to know about systems. So to continue with 1.4, we need to define a system. Why is the Earth a system? And so let's go look at a definition of a system. So the Earth is a dynamic, so changing body with many separate but highly interacting parts or spheres that we were just talking about, right? Like the hydrosphere. How does that affect the geosphere? Well, you've got waves that can crash and erode rocks, right? You've got water that can get in between, that can get into rocks and then freeze and split them apart. So anyway, so we've got a hydrosphere that can affect a geosphere. And the geosphere, of course, as it erodes, it produces chemicals that affects the hydrosphere. So those two can interact with each other. Anyway, so we've got all these interacting parts. So when we look at Earth science, Earth system science is looking at the Earth as a system with many parts, what we might call subsystems. Anyway, a system is a group of interacting parts that form a complex whole. So our planet is very complex, much more complex than Mars, where Mars doesn't have plates that are moving around. Its core has cooled down. So it's much less complex than the Earth. We think. We don't know everything about Mars yet. Okay, so some information about systems. Systems can be closed systems or open systems. Closed system is self-contained. So some people like to say an automobile cooling system. The water flows around, right? Flows through the system and it gets warm and from the motor being hot, and then a fan will cool it. So the thing is, it's not a completely closed system. The water stays in the pipes, but the energy, it absorbs heat energy and then it radiates that energy outward. Okay, an open system has energy and matter that flow into and out of the system. And so anyway, so open systems are have a lot of flow. So let's look at our planet Earth. Is it a closed system? No, right? It's not closed because we have energy from the sun that comes in. And we're going to talk about how our planet radiates energy outwards. And we also have matter. So there's energy that flows into and out of our planet, but also matter. Every night, rocks fall upon the Earth. We call them meteors, sometimes asteroids. Anyway, so even that, we're not a closed system. Now, the International Space Station is more closed, at least until the astronauts zoom back to Earth or they bring a ship full of food and stuff back up to the International Space Station. But most of the time it's fairly closed, right? Oxygen stays in there, and everything that's done in there has to be carefully balanced so that you don't get too moist, for instance. It's pretty nasty if your space station gets too wet, so you have to control the humidity. Anyway, because everything's locked in there. What about your house? Is it closed? Probably not, right? You're bringing food into the house, you take out the trash. Um, Heat comes into the house during the summer, during the winter. Heat is constantly draining from your house, so it gets cold. So, anyway, so then we have to bring in natural gas so that we can burn it. Anyway, closed, not a closed system. Okay, so it's very hard to find a closed system. So, the Earth, not closed. So, the Earth is a system and it has a nearly endless array of subsystems, which could be cycles like the hydrological cycle, the rock cycle. So, hydrological cycle would be something like it rains, the rain goes into rivers, then water gets evaporated from the ocean. Now, the rivers go down to the ocean evaporates water, that goes to the mountainside, becomes rain. And so, you have a cycle of water, many, many, many cycles. And we'll be talking about the rock cycle in chapter 3. So many, many cycles. Carbon cycle. Okay, now one of the things we're going to be looking at, especially when we talk about climate change, are feedback loops, feedback mechanisms. So positive feedback mechanisms enhance the system. So what that means is that the effect of some change will get bigger and bigger as it cycles through. A negative feedback mechanism resists change and it stabilizes the system. Okay, so I've got 2 examples of this coming up. So one of the feedback loops that's involved in climate change is the melting of permafrost. So for a positive change, a positive feedback loop does not mean good. It means, as it said, the effect is enhanced. It gets greater and greater with each iteration of the cycle. So what happens is that temperatures have been rising around the planet. That causes the permafrost in the ground to melt up in the northern tundra area and the south too. When the permafrost melts, it releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. That increases the temperature. That melts more permafrost. that makes more carbon dioxide and methane, which increases the temperature again. So this is one of the cycles where things are getting worse and worse on our planet. We're going to talk about that in climate change, but there's something like 40 feedback loops involved in climate change, more than 40 probably, but we will study a couple of those. Okay, now negative feedback loops can inhibit change. So one of the things that people were trying to figure out is how big would be the feedback loop, the connection between temperature and cloud cover. So you increase the temperature, that causes an increase in evaporation. That should cause an increase in cloud cover, and that shades the earth, and so then you get reduced temperature. So an increase in temperature eventually leads to a reduction in temperature. Unfortunately, we have not found this loop to be as powerful as, for instance, the permafrost melt loop. And it's not all types of clouds, only some types of clouds are in this second loop. So anyway, but that's the idea. That's one of the reasons climate change is a very, very complex subject, is because you have all these loops that have to be studied, and scientists need to look at them and see how great their effects are and how easily they will be enhanced or reduced during their next cycle. Okay, so the Earth, is it a closed system? No, not a closed system, right? It's an open system. One of the places is with energy. The sun has energy coming into our planet. Okay, so sunshine pours down on our planet, heats it up. Also, of course, energy leaves our planet in the form of infrared rays. So we also send radiation out into space. Another place, the Earth has heat. All the heat in the core of the Earth that comes up, drives processes, volcanoes, and then some of that gets radiated out into space too. So anyway, so it's not a closed system. There's energy that can come in and energy that can leave. And of course, humans are also part of our Earth system. We also affect change. Okay, so what's the last thing in this chapter? Well, I moved 1.3. So the stages and formation of our solar system. Now we're going to cover space in the last couple of chapters. But this little introduction is giving you a taste of what's going to happen more in those chapters. Okay, so let's go look at how our planet was created. Okay, so when we do the space stuff, you're going to learn about some of these things that you probably don't know much about. So you probably know our solar system has the sun, and it has planets, and it has asteroids and comets. But you may not have heard of the Kuiper Belt or the Oort cloud. So you're just going to have to wait till we study that part of our planet. So I may talk about the Kuiper Belt today. Okay, so anyway, so the nebular theory is the idea that the sun and the planets formed from a cloud of gas and dust, which we call a nebula. And so the nebula, these are particles of dust out in space and gases. The dust is more like the size of smoke from, so very small particles. And there's a lot of dust and gas out of space. Some of it's there because of stars that blew up long ago. So the idea is that gravity will pull these particles together. And as the particles gather together, they start to clump and they start to spin faster. So this is called conservation of angular momentum, that they would spin faster and faster as they get closer and closer together. And eventually they form the shape of a spinning disk. Okay, so mostly we've got a disk here with a ball in the middle. This becomes the sun, and the parts out here will become the planet. Conservation of angular momentum is where you've got a rotating mass. And you can think of this as an ice skater. You've probably seen ice skaters do this, or snowboarders. And what happens is when they want to spin faster, they pull their limbs in closer to the center of their body, or they curl up. So an ice skater will pull her limbs in, and then she's able to spin faster. Same thing with a snowboarder. They'll reach down, grab their snowboard, and then they can do spins. And divers do the same thing, right? A diver starts out stretched out, but then when they want to spin, they are curling up in a ball. Anyway, so the mass of the rotating object contracts, the velocity increases. Okay, so now we've got this mass of dust spinning faster. And what happens is most of it goes into the sun. That's about 99% of all the mass in our solar system. And so we believe this occurred about 4.5 billion years ago. And most of the mass was gathered there. But the dust out here started to gather also. Little pieces bumped into each other, became small rocks. Those small rocks collided into other small rocks. Eventually, they created small planets, or planetesimals. There were probably around 200 planetesimals. Then those kept smacking into each other until eventually we ended up with our basic 8 planets, plus Pluto and some other minor planets. And of course, Jupiter is our biggest planet. So gradually the planetesimals gathered more and more matter. And so as they would go around the sun, they would gather together the dust and gradually clear out lanes, and then pretty much clear out all the dust in the main central disk. Now, we can actually see this happening out in space. So here's a picture of a protoplanetary disk, and it's got a baby sun in the center. And then you can see the tracks where the planets are forming, gathering matter. And so they're going to get bigger and bigger until they take away most of the matter and it's been absorbed into the planets. However, there will be some stuff left over on the outside that doesn't get absorbed. And that is what in our planetary system is called the Kuiper Belt. And so the Kuiper Belt is some leftover material from the beginning of the solar system. And that's usually where Pluto hangs out. So Pluto is usually out here in the Kuiper Belt. And there are other little planetesimals out here still, like Sedna and Orca. And so that's one reason Pluto stopped being a major planet, is because we started finding Pluto had friends out here in the Kuiper Belt. Okay, so we'll all get to talk about that when we do the astronomy chapters. Okay, so that is the end of this talk. And so have a good day. The PowerPoints, of course, are available online.